Ramadan, yes, April Fools. Some love it, some hate it, but it's been part of modern culture now for a long time. But I wonder where does it come from? No.
Well, I'll tell you who's going to tell us. Our favourite folklorist, Lehane, is here to explain all.
Well, I'll do my very best.
Shane, you always come with a bag of stories, and this is no different.
I tell you, it's a bit of a challenge, but I have to tell you this morning, first thing.
Yeah.
Dottie, you put me onto this one actually last time we were on. So I opened the curtains this morning, and Maura, my long-suffering partner, was there, and I said, "My goodness, it's snowing," says I. And she went up both right to them. And you know, she loves weather and meteorology and all those things. It was certainly not forecast.
That's what my mother used to do to us. And I remember telling the story to Shane. My mother caught us every fool's morning. And we always ran over because if it snowed by us, right, we were always allowed to be off from school because it only snowed once every 10 years. So it wasn't the fact that there was snow, it was the fact we didn't have to go to we always did.
I heard of a story last year of somebody, it was Saturday it fell on last year, I'm nearly sure, and they got their kids up for school and they said, "You have to make up an extra day because of the snow." And the kids got ready and there was no school. I thought it was a bit rain.
So the origins of this, actually, when you read about this and you look it up and so on, nobody's quite sure, but I think we have a number of interesting connections. First of all, there was a time when the new year, believe it or not, began on the 25th of March. Remember, it wasn't too long ago, Dottie, you'll remember when you put your tax returns in, it was in around the 4th of April and so on. So I still think in the UK they still have their tax returns at this time. So the old New Year, if you like, was the 25th of March. It was kind of an anchor in the calendar and so on. And then in 1582 they decided to change it, and again in 1782 Ireland adopted the new calendar and we went back to the 1st of January. So anybody who was still operating on the old calendar, if you like, was somehow operating was a fool in a way, because they were backward. They were they were silly.
They hadn't moved on.
They hadn't moved on. There was also a problem when they moved those calendrical dates. They took 10 days in the early part and 11 days out of the calendar. So people didn't know whether it was Easter or whether it was Old Easter, whether it was the 1st of April or was it the 11th of April, and there was all of that sort of confusion. So people who were still operating on that old system of the old way, they were picked out. So that was one origin. The other thing is that at Easter time as well, you had everyone, I heard you observing the Lenten fasts and so on. And therefore what happened is that they used to have these sort of people who were against that. And there was a lot of jesters around, a lot of jokers around. The Borracheen, as we call them, the fellow with the crooked legs, the joker. They would be people who were involved in what we call the old medieval miracle plays. So in and around Easter time, a lot of people put on pageants representing the crucifixion of Christ and so on. And one of the favourite figures was the fool, Tom Fool. So tomfoolery comes from that. And quite often the Tom Fool, as sometimes he was called Tosspot, as he was known in England and so on, they were often the focus of the plays around this time of year. So this was a time for joking and tomfoolery. These were some of my students actually in Colossus Stephen. We reenacted some of the old miracle plays or mumming plays that used to have tomfoolery and messing around in all sorts of shapes and form at that time of the year. So
it was all kind of harmless though, Shane, was it?
It wasn't, because it was a time when the world was turned upside down. So the fool became the king, if you like. The fool became someone who, because they were kind of respected and because they were sharp-witted and so on.
Were they afraid of them?
Oh, you'd be afraid because you could get a tongue lashing, and you could, quite often they were small, they were diminutive, they had all of those aspects to them. But I suppose the great tradition as well then was that it was a time when you had apprentices starting off. The new work of the year was starting off at this time, and you'd often have the idea of giving someone a sign. Usually they were illiterate, they couldn't read or write, and you'd say, "Send the fool further." And what would happen is that someone would come along and say, "Oh, that note, do you know where you go with that note? Go down to Johnny, a mile down the road, And what I like about that is that in Scotland that was called hunting the gook, and the gook in that time was the cuckoo. And the cuckoo comes at this time of the year.
So it all ties in.
So the gook, as they would call him, would be that the fool was the gook. And we often say to people, he's a bit cuckoo, that fellow. We use the term cuckoo for the fool as well. I remember my mother, her birthday, the 15th of April, she used to have the rhyme, the cuckoo comes in April, it sings its song in May, in June it sings a merry tune, in July it flies away. And she used to have that lovely story. So we associate the coming crowing of the cuckoo with April and that sort of period in time.
And it's kind of that transition as well in one sense between spring and we're kind of going towards summer as well.
And we're beginning the beginning of, and all of those ideas of sending the apprentice, or one of the things they do in France, of course, it's called Poisson d'Avril, the fish of April. And people in France used to take little fish and they used to stick them onto people's backs. And if you were a Poisson d'Avril, but I was working out what the Poisson was. Again, going back to the idea of eating fish during Lent. If you were still eating it when you weren't meant to be eating it, that it was gone, you were still a Poisson, you were still a fish eater and so on. And we have old traditions in Cork of, chalking the back of people's overcoats as well, in and around that, and they would make the sign of the fish, because that was the sign of Ichthus, which was the sign of Jesus Christ, the Saviour, and so on. That was the old symbol of Christianity. So you get that kind of connection coming up.
It's very agriculture and maritime, isn't it? It's back to basics, I suppose.
It all fits in.
And there's so much history to it. I would have. You think, just a bit of
tomfoolery,
shenanigans. But it goes back
there's a lovely
so
one,
far.
and I'm glad that we have a meteorologist with us, because these days are known as the three days of what we call the old brindled cow on Shanvo Riavok, the old striped cow. And the story of the old striped cow, here's an example of one of the old cows. These are a very rare breed of cow. And in Ireland in the past, the cow had come through the whole winter period, and March was over, and the 1st of April was upon us, and the cow said, I'm after living right through the winter, I'm going to make it another year. And with that March, which is kind of a cosmic agency, it said, okay, I'm going to borrow 3 days from April, the 1st, the 2nd and the 3rd, and I'm going to make the weather really bad for those 3 days. And in the 3 days, didn't they kill the old brindled cow? And so everybody now knows those 3 days as, when March is finished and April comes, don't be foolish. The winter isn't over. Around the equinox, you're going to get all the storms, and so don't be putting your seedlings out. Don't be going to the bog cutting your turf, because if the frost gets it, it'll turn to brus. People had all the wisdom of wait.
But did people call it Old March as well? Because I heard somebody speaking about that actually in the pub on Saturday night. They said Old March, but it was the 10 days.
There you are.
The 10 days of April that were stolen from.
So here we go. So what happened is, remember I said they took days out of the calendar. So instead of now the 1st, it actually begins on the 11th of April, and the 3 days of the brindled cow on Shanbo Riavok are from the 11th, 12th and 13th, and they were called the Old March days.
The Old March days,
So the old, right up to the middle, and I would have always heard that the 15th of April was the time when the frost was probably gone, so the mid-April would have been those days as well, absolutely.
And the thing about Irish weather is it never met on anything.
But there was other little things, you'd always be fooled very easily, you'd be sent for, if you were an apprentice, you'd be sent for a bucket of steam. Or elbow grease was another one, or stripy paint, or a left-handed screwdriver, or all of these different ones.
I had always heard as well, if you do the April Fool after midday, it comes back on you. So you have to do your job early in the day. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. What did they? There was one I could try to remember. It was something about April Fool or something. Kiss the leg of a black stool or something. Go to school. So there was if you did it after 12 o'clock, you were the fool. So everything had to stop by that point. You're bang on.
So if Maura tells you your partner there's a storm tonight,
that's it.
She's got with the snow.
That's her opportunity.
But it's funny because I did it with the young fellow this morning, and I was there saying, and we were trying to explain to him, and I was glad we did, because he went to school this morning and they were all at it inside the yard, and I thought it was brilliant. To read that there's a shack behind you where they're all they were caught in each other.
If you keep it simple, people fall for it. If you go too elaborate, they're going to smell around.
Your back wheel is going around, and we saw the behind they were simple. But it's amazing, isn't it, Dolly, that they're still happening. It's still going on. It's still happening at one day in the year. There's a day to do it. There's a time to do it. And what I love about our folklore and our folk tradition is how that is maintained. And we are the ones that keep it going.
That's the thing. But I love the way it all goes back to nature again. It goes back to the simplicity of life, about pulling the wool over someone's eyes, having a bit of crack and moving on.
Yeah, incredible.
It's brilliant.
I've got Dahi 3 times today.
3 times today.
He still thinks there's a stain on that jacket.
I'm not looking down anymore, Shane, that's what I'm saying. Shane, thank you. But we shall say, Madon, Kiadlad O'Brien, full 1st of April, that's what we used to say. Madon O'Brien, there we have it. So you're going to be back in a few weeks' time chatting about Easter, I believe.
No, that's a joke.
Yeah.
Go on.
You're booked.